Welcome to the first part of my algebra series. In this part, we're going to be talking about variables and why algebra is useful in the first place. So algebra is incredibly important and useful for any math-based exams and for general calculations that you're going to be doing in the future. So hopefully by the end of the video, I'll show you why it's so useful and important. So what we're going to start off with is what are variables. So let's imagine for a second that your weekly pay, is £100, okay? So you're getting paid £100 every single week. However, your boss or manager comes up to you and says that you're going to get paid an additional £10 for every hour of overtime that you do. So, for example, if you work no overtime, you get paid £100. If you get paid, work 1 hour overtime, you get £110. So that's 1 hour, 0 hours. And then for 2 hours, you're going to get paid £120, etc., etc. Right, so the way we would write that mathematically is we'd say, okay, so it's plus an additional £10 times by the number of hours overtime. Yeah? So if we have a look at that, so when we work 0 hours of overtime, we're doing 100 plus 10 times 0 is 100. And then for 1 hour it'd be 110, 2 hours would be 120. Okay? So what this is it's an equation for our weekly pay. So can you see that it changes based on the number of hours of overtime that we work? Right? We call this a variable, okay? So these two things here, so the weekly pay and the number of hours overtime, are called variables because they vary. So the word vary just means to change. So depending on how many number of hours of overtime we work, we get a different amount of weekly pay. So we call the weekly pay the dependent variable because it depends on the number of hours overtime that we work. Okay? So it's the one that changes based on the number of hours that we work. If we work more hours overtime, our weekly pay changes. And we call the number of hours overtime the independent variable because it's the one that we change, right? So 1 week we might work extra hours of overtime, which will change our weekly pay automatically. But what we actually have direct control over is the number of hours overtime that we work. Okay? So the dependent variable is always going to be on one side of the equation, of the equal sign here, and the independent variable is always going to be on the opposite side of the equal sign. So can you see that we have the dependent variable on the left-hand side of the equal sign, and the independent variable on the right-hand side of the equal sign. So another way to think of independent variables, so independent variables are the ones we put numbers into. So if you have a look at this left and right-hand side here, we put in the number of hours of overtime and we got out a certain number of amount of pay. So the dependent variable can similarly be described as the ones that we get numbers out of. So for this reason, our dependent variable is going to be on the left-hand side of the equation and the independent variable is going to be on the right-hand side of the equation. The reason for that is we put in the number of hours overtime and we get out the amount of pay we get paid per week. So this is really useful because we can actually work out what our weekly pay is going to be based on the number of hours that we've worked. So this is good for two reasons. One, we can predict how much we should get paid, and two, because we can check to see if we've been paid the correct amount. So if our manager pays us £110 but we know we've worked 3 hours of overtime, we know that they've underpaid us and we can get that corrected. So let's go through a little example here. So how much money would we make if we worked 5 hours overtime? Okay, so we worked 5 hours overtime. So if we write that down here. Well, if we look at our equation, our weekly pay is going to be equal to the £100, that doesn't change, plus 10, times the number of hours overtime. So in this case we've got 5 hours of overtime. Okay, so all I've done is I've replaced the number of hours overtime with the number 5. Okay, so just replaced the words with the number. So we can work this out now. We've got 100 plus 10 times 5 is 50. So we should get paid £150. Okay, so that is really useful to know. So we can also work out how many hours of overtime we worked based on our pay. So what you might find is that when you get your pay slip, it'll say that you earn a certain amount of money. So let's say we got paid £200. Yeah? We can work out how much overtime we worked, because we know that the weekly pay, so in this case the weekly pay is 200, so we're going to write 200 is equal to 100 plus 10 times the hours of overtime we worked. Okay? So then what must this number be right here? What must our independent variable be? Well, I have a number which is 100, and I add 10 times a number to get 200. So this number here on this this second term here must equal 100, right? Because 100 plus 100. 10 times what gives me 100? Well, 10 does. So I must have worked 10 hours overtime. So again, if you imagine in real life, we can keep track of how many hours overtime we think we worked, compare it to the amount of overtime they paid us for, and we can check if they paid us the correct amount, which is super, super useful. So, I don't know about you, but when I'm writing out these equations over and over again, every time I'm using it, I'm getting a bit tired of writing out weekly pay and hours of overtime, etc. And it turns out that mathematicians are also lazy, just like I am. So instead of writing out these long words here, instead what we like to do is we use letters to represent our variables as opposed to kind of a long list of words. If you look up here, number of hours overtime, that's 4 words. This is weekly pay, it's another 2 words. So instead what we do to be nice and lazy and save us a bit of time is we use single letters. So here's how that works. So what we would normally do is we would say let y equals weekly pay. And I'll go why we use these letters in a moment. And x equals the hours of overtime. Okay? So all we're doing is we're saying let y equal this and x equal this. This means our equation can be written as, instead of weekly pay, we're just writing the letter y. The 100 stays exactly the same. And then we're going to add 10 times x. Okay? So, just for notation's sake, a lot of the time we use x to represent our independent variable, and y we use to represent our dependent variable. This is just a notation that's evolved, but honestly you can use any letters you want. I could use P and Q, or Z and A, B and C, whatever you want. It really doesn't make a difference. Now, if you have a look here, the multiplication sign is a bit similar to the X symbol, right? So X we normally write like this. In maths, we tend to use a curly X because otherwise it looks too much like a multiply sign. Okay? But even still, it's a bit unclear, right? If I wrote times X, they look somewhat similar. And to save us even more time, we don't write the multiply sign in algebra. So instead we can write this as y equals 100 plus 10x. So whenever you want to multiply two things in algebra, you don't even write the multiply sign. You just write 10x. Okay, and that just means 10 times x, which means 10 times the hours of overtime that you've done. Okay? So, that makes it a lot simpler to write. This whole thing here represents all of this. Look how long this is. It's half a page wide compared to this, which is tiny. Okay, so since we're lazy, we can just write it out nice and neatly. So, let's look at another example just to show you how powerful this can be. So what we're trying to do is I'm trying to split £120 between people. Okay? Now, the number of people changes, okay? I want to split this £120 between me and my friends, but the number of friends I'm splitting it with changes every single time. So, okay, let's start by just subbing some numbers in, right? So if there's one person, each person would get £120 because there's only one person, right? And if there are two people, how do we work that out? Well, if there's two people and we have £120, we'd do 120 divided by 2, which is £60 each. Yeah? And then if we had 3 people, that's 120 divided by 3, which is £40. Okay? Each. So, in this case, now what we could do is we could keep subbing in numbers, right? We could go 4 people, 5 people, 6 people, 7 people, 8 people, 9 people, and so on forever. Now the thing is, this is really inconvenient because I don't know how many people I'm going to have, and I don't want to have to work this out a million times. Instead, we can use an equation. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let y equal the amount of money each person gets, so money each person gets, okay? And can you see that this is our dependent variable? Because this is the thing that changes based on the number of people. Yeah? The more people we have, the less money we get. So it's our dependent variable because it depends on the number of people. So we're going to let y equal that. And x is going to equal the number of people. And again, this is independent because we're changing the number of people, right? So we're changing the number of people, which then changes the money each person gets. So this value here is independent because we're changing it, and y is dependent because it changes based on the number of people. So now we can write this out as an equation. So we have y equals 120 divided by x. Okay? So, again, we don't like multiplication symbols in algebra. We also don't like divide symbols. And this is for a few different reasons. One, it's going to help us manipulate these equations, which we'll come on to a bit later. And two, because imagine if there's multiple things we're dividing by, right? So if I kept adding on more stuff, it's hard to tell what's being divided by what. So instead, we actually use fractions. So hopefully I haven't made you all just cry by mentioning fractions. But honestly, this is the best way to deal with this. We have y equals 120 over x. Okay? And this makes things a lot simpler for us. So what we're going to do now is we can sub in some numbers now, right? So if you have a look at the values up here, one person was £120, so we'd have y equals 120 divided by 1, which is 120. Divided by 2 gives me 60, divided by 3 gives me 40. And like I said, we can also work backwards. So let's say that each person got £12. How many people were there? Well, if I sub that in, each person got 12, so that's our dependent variable. So 120 over x. So 120 divided by what gives me 12? Well, that must be 10. So there must be 10 people here. And algebra just lets us create these equations and sort out everything we need to know. And it's going to be vitally important. So this is just a brief introduction into variables and what our dependent and independent variables are going to be, and roughly how we write out algebra, so some of the notations. So for example, using fractions instead of divide, and then just putting the numbers next to each other if we want to multiply them. So I hope that you found this quite useful, and stay tuned for the later videos where we're going to kind of go through manipulating equations and applying them to exam situations. And as always, have a truly wonderful day.